All right, morning, everyone. My name is Keith Barrio, and I'm the CNEI officer here at Kazan, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, Creating Transformative Change, Enacting Epistemic Justice in Nursing Practice Education in Scholarship and Research. This is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series, with today focusing on enacting epistemic justice in knowledge production and research practice. Before I jump into more information about today's presentation, I'd like us to all take a moment and pay respect to the lands on which we are situated. The Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing respectfully acknowledges that its national office is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Kazan would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. And we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Today's webinar will begin with the presentation, and we'll conclude with time for questions at the end. To submit questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we encourage you to also use the chat function to discuss and share with your fellow participants. The resources for today's presentation will also be shared as links in chat. A notice as well is that today's presentation will be recorded and posted on Kazan's YouTube channel for future viewing. You can also review parts 1 and 2 there as well. And with that, I am pleased and honored to have with us today Ashley McEwen, Shokofe Mandalu, and Catherine Holmes. Thank you very much to all our speakers for coming today for the presentation. And with that, I turn things over to them.
Thanks, Keith. Welcome to our third session in about creating transformative change surrounding integrating epistemic justice into our nursing practice, education, and scholarship. And today we're really going to be focusing on our knowledge production practices, discussing mentoring graduate students and applying an epistemic justice lens to their research. We're also going to talk about including an epistemic justice lens in our systematic and scoping review processes, as well as how we might integrate epistemic justice in our scholarship, particularly our research and our teaching, our scholarship of teaching and learning. So we wanted to also acknowledge the land, as Keith has as well, particularly from the context of Western University, and that we are gathering on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape and Connaughton peoples, and lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. If you watch our first webinar series, we spoke to the land that we're working on in detail and in depth because this is really integral to our work. But these lands do continue to be and to sustain vibrant Indigenous communities and First Nations communities whose knowledge systems and governance structures predate and persist beyond colonial borders. And as researchers and scholars and educators coming to this session, we wanted to recognize that many dominant methodologies were shaped by colonial worldviews and commit to interrogating how we can, as researchers here today, maybe consider how our practices could reproduce or resist these systems. So in doing so, we'd like to make some space for Indigenous ways of knowing and move towards methodologies in our discussion today that are relational, reciprocal, grounded in respect, responsibility, reconciliation, and reciprocity. And we wanted to introduce ourselves for those who are new and haven't been able to join our first two webinars. So I'll quickly position myself, but I shared a little bit in more detail in the first webinar series. But I'm a cisgendered straight white settler of Irish and Scottish descent. I come to this work from a significant place of privilege. My appearance does allow me to navigate space with quite a lot of unearned privilege. In the same way, I do hold invisible identities that experience oppressive challenges. I'm a single mom. I'm a survivor of domestic violence. I'm neurodivergent. And so these identities also shape the way I teach and the way I move through spaces. My work as a nurse educator is really grounded in the perspective that academia has really long privileged Euro-Western colonial ways of knowing, and I'm really committed to my ongoing unlearning and working towards holding multiple truths and unlearning and decolonizing my own mind.
Great. I can go next. So I'm Katie Holmes. I'm also a cisgender straight white woman of English and Scottish ancestry. So I acknowledge that I'm coming to this work too with significant privilege. Here at Western, I work as a teaching and learning librarian, and I specialize in the health sciences. And I became interested in knowledge justice because I felt there was something not quite right in the way that myself as a librarian was teaching about information and knowledge systems. And so I'm excited to be here today, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, and my name is Shakufa Modanlu. I'm a Canadian Iranian woman of Kurdish and Gileki ancestry, and I'm also assistant professor at School of Nursing, Western University, where I also lead a program of research titled Critical Studies in Global Health Justice. I engage research as relational, ethical, and political practice, and I use participatory, community-led methodology to amplify the voices of displaced women and other marginalized groups. So these approaches embody my belief that those most impacted by injustices should lead the work of change. Across my roles as educator, researcher, and collaborator, I strive to create spaces where multiple epistemologies can coexist and co-generate transformative knowledge. For me, this line of work and research should not only inform, but it also transform the way we produce knowledge and advance equity and amplifying marginalized voices. And I view the scholarship of teaching and learning and research as a space where epistemic justice must be intentionally enacted. So my own lived experience of displacement, migration, and living in the third space within the cultural hybridity have shown me how dominant academic paradigms often devalue marginalized global and experiential way of knowing. So this awareness kind of drives me and my commitment to methodologies that change epistemic hierarchies and honor plural, relational, and situated form of knowledge. Thank you.
So, as Keith kind of just pointed out, this is part three of a four-part series, and the other ones can be viewed on Codsen's YouTube channel. We've talked about in depth how we teach this to undergraduate students and what we can do as educators in terms of enacting epistemic justice in our pedagogical practices. And today we're going to be focusing on research and scholarship more specifically. Our final session, which I hope you'll also join, will really focus on systemic level change. So today we are going to do a quick review from our last sessions, just for those who haven't been able to join at all. And then we're going to talk about how we've been teaching epistemic justice to a graduate audience, including talking about using epistemic justice as a lens for critical appraisal, as well as how we've been applying it to evidence synthesis. And then we're going to end with Faye largely speaking about research from epistemologically just methodologies. That's all I'll say about that. Katie, go ahead.
All right, so just to offer some context to get us started, our work on epistemic justice really began in 2021 when Western's teaching and learning librarians set out to decolonize Western libraries' information literacy curriculum. And we made the significant decision to move away from the ACRL framework concepts, which are largely adopted within this field. And instead developed a new epistemic justice centered curriculum, which can be found on the Western Library's website, which we have linked to here. And if you're interested in more about the curriculum decolonization process, you can read this article written by my colleagues Heather Campbell and Dan Sitch. And also coming out of that, so the decolonized library curriculum was a great start for us, but we still needed to figure out like how to actually teach this and how to speak about it in practice. And so we wrote this book or open educational resource called Knowledge Justice in the Helping Professions from Theory to Practice. And this book really offers a foundation for the content that we'll cover today. It's also available freely through eCampus Ontario's Pressbooks using a Creative Commons license. All right, and this is just a breakdown of the different chapters of the book, which we talked about a lot in the first webinar if you were there. Today we're going to largely be focusing on chapter 4 and 5, searching for diverse voices and evaluating and positioning knowledge sources as a foundation for some of the research production practices and epistemic justice informed approaches that we'll be covering.
And so I just wanted to also reshare the definition of epistemic justice that we've been using within our work. And this was informed by many scholars. Particularly, we have leaned into decolonial theorists and indigenous theorists in terms of their use of cognitive imperialism and empires of epistemologies. And often when we do teach this to undergraduate students, which we shared in our earlier webinars, we like to use the term knowledge justice because it supports the cognitive load that students are trying to move through as they're learning this. But today we'll probably likely use the term epistemic justice more frequently as we're talking about this in terms of our research and our scholarship practices. So, knowledge justice then is based on the principle that every person has the equal capacity to be knowledgeable, yet this right is often denied to the individuals based on the social identities that they hold. It also involves recognizing that some knowledge systems, particularly those of Indigenous peoples, have been purposely ignored, silenced, or eliminated. And to practice knowledge justice, then, which we are going to discuss today, we must challenge the dominance of Euro-Western systems and act on our responsibility to engage in meaningful dialogue across multiple and diverse perspectives. This requires approaching our own ways of knowing with humility, acknowledging the edges or the limits of what we understand. And then by doing so, we can learn to see the world through multiple ways of knowing and approach diverse epistemologies with an open mind. So we wanted to start off talking about our experiences of teaching epistemic justice to a graduate audience. And in the first two webinars, we have spoken to positionality work being as an integral first step to this work. And this is also true when we are interrogating the epistemological foundations of nursing. Whether we're doing this in our own research or teaching scholarship, or we're supporting students to do this, either in undergraduate or graduate knowledge production practices, when they are reflecting on how they're producing knowledge within the discipline, this is a really critical first step. So, as we discussed in prior workshops, we like to use this specific flower for our positionality work, which is in chapter 1, because it also has a petal for preferred ways of knowing. And in doing so, it also names that scientific objective ways of knowing and doing are the norm in Canadian contexts, and these ways of knowing are privileged. It also names that other ways of knowing and doing and being, like Indigenous and other diverse knowledge systems, are oppressed in Canadian academic contexts and healthcare contexts if we're thinking about nursing specifically. And it highlights that if your preferred way of doing and being is scientific objectivity, you may in fact actually be blinded to other diverse epistemologies because the world was made for the way you think about it. And this can perpetuate harm to the missing, silenced, and dismissed epistemologies from the academy and the knowledge production practices of nursing education or nursing itself as a discipline. Now, when we ask learners to critically reflect, or when we engage in our own reflection on positionality and preferred ways of knowing, we often encounter a necessary process of unlearning. In my own nursing education and among most of the students that I've taught in a graduate level, we were socialized in a discipline to believe that there exists a hierarchy of knowledge. We were taught often, without question, the highest and most legitimate form of knowledge is that which comes from peer peer-reviewed empiric evidence-based research, the kind that fits within this level of evidence pyramid you see here. Students are often very familiar with this. And so when we invite students or even ourselves to critically interrogate how knowledge is produced within our discipline, we also have to recognize that this involves an unlearning of those deeply entrenched hierarchies that is part of a person's way of being, perhaps. And this means questioning that what we have been taught to value as truth and whose knowledge has been systematically excluded in that process. I always emphasize to learners that this is also not about dismissing empirical post-positivist research at all. That work is profoundly important to our profession and continues to shape our practice in very meaningful ways. The argument, rather, is that other knowledge production, like community-based, experiential, or relational ways of knowing, also is valuable and holds that equal value. So when we place these diverse ways of knowing in a rigid hierarchy, we can really create harm. We narrow the epistemic boundaries of our discipline in nursing, and we silence other valid knowledge systems. And ultimately, we can really limit the quality of care that we are offering to the very communities that we are intending to serve. Within academic context, then, would you go to the hierarchy picture? Thank you, Katie. There are also a hierarchy of research paradigms. So a hierarchy that shapes whose ways of knowing are legitimized and whose are marginalized. Traditional Western paradigms like post-positivism and positivism are often privileged because they align with dominant academic values of objectivity and control and the pursuit for universal truth. And these approaches view reality as something that's fixed, measurable, and separate from the knower. Indigenous and relational paradigms understand reality as interconnected, woven among the living and non-living, including land and water and animal and spirit. And these worldviews resist the rigid structures of settler colonialism, the heteropatriarchy, and global capitalism that really continue to underpin the academy. For many nursing scholars and researchers, particularly those engaging in decolonial, community-based, arts-informed work, this can create tension. Working within these systems that is not designed for them and is often excluding them. So in looking at this chart here, I'd invite you to just take a pause and look at this hierarchy of research paradigms and ask yourself, where does your own work sit in this hierarchy? How does your way of being align with your research paradigm? And if you occupy a place of privilege within academic systems, how might you use that privilege to create space for others? So when we work with graduate students, especially those beginning to position themselves as nurse scholars, we often encourage them to interrogate their own knowledge production practices. We ask them reflective questions like I just asked you, things like what considerations do you need to make about your background and methodology to ensure your research takes a knowledge justice informed lens? Or how will you incorporate marginalized and silenced voices in your project? Or what kinds of research questions or methods might help you address systemic barriers to inclusion? And how might you intentionally disrupt colonial and Eurocentric knowledge production practices as you contribute to nursing scholarship through your thesis work? Now, these questions are not meant to unsettle for the sake of discomfort, but they are designed actually to prompt ethical, reflective, and justice-oriented scholarship within the discipline. So this process is really central to enacting epistemic justice in our knowledge production practices because it reminds us that how we come to know things and whose knowledge we center has real implications for equity, inclusion, and the kind of nursing discipline that we are collectively trying to build as scholars. So when teaching epistemic justice and knowledge pluralism to graduate nursing students, particularly MSc and doctoral learners, we often face significant pedagogical challenges. Many of these students come from healthcare environments where positivist and post-positivist paradigms are deeply entrenched. They've been trained to value that empiric, peer-reviewed, and measurable evidence above others. And as a result, some of them are experiencing quite a lot of discomfort or resistance when invited to consider other epistemologies, such as interpretivist or critical or feminist or indigenous or arts-based approaches. For MSN students, who often are open to taking an epistemic justice lens in their thesis work, they can also experience practical constraints. So these methodologies often require longer timelines, deep reflexivity, and iterative engagement with community partners, maybe. So, which can really extend their thesis completion timing beyond the program limits. And pragmatically, students may, in fact, then choose post-positivist approaches simply because they are faster and more fundable. But this can, of course, create a disciplinary imbalance where the majority of graduate work can continue to reproduce those dominant paradigms then. So we also see tensions between students and supervisor paradigms at times. This is something that Katie often sees in her role in supporting graduate students. But for instance, when students do wish to take a more decolonial or critical approach, but encounter supervisors that are more comfortable with traditional designs. Reflexivity around positionality can also be a challenge. Some students are hesitant to name or disclose their positionality in their dissertation, and sometimes that could be about discomfort, but at other times it also could be about safety. So particularly for students from equity deserving communities, so that's something to consider as we mentor graduate students. And then finally, I would just add structural factors like funding inequities really reinforce this imbalance. So critical, exploratory, and community engaged research is less likely to receive funding, while empiric and quantitative work is often more prioritized. So these structural barriers can also limit learning spaces and methodology and restrict the diversity of knowledge that is being generated within nursing scholarship. Faye, is there anything else you'd add there about some of the challenges we've walked through?
I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about what we came to talk about today. So we wanted to talk about epistemic justice from a critical appraisal lens. But given these pedagogical and structural challenges that I just talked about, we want to talk about maybe how we can disrupt some of these patterns and create space for more equitable and inclusive forms of knowledge production in nursing. So this could be in our teaching, in our scholarship, in our research. And what we've really begun to intentionally do is address these systemic barriers. And this means not only talking about epistemic justice as a concept to students, but practicing it and how we are teaching graduate students to generate and engage with research and generate knowledge, and how we supervise graduate students, and also how we ourselves conduct research. So in this webinar, we're really going to focus on three things. One of them is critical appraisal through an epistemic justice lens. One of them is designing evidence synthesis methodologies using this epistemic justice lens. So we're centering diverse epistemologies and doing so. And then finally, we're going to speak about producing disciplinary knowledge in an epistemically just way. And together, we're hoping that this conversation around interrogating these approaches will really help us all walk away and think about the knowledge our discipline is producing and legitimizing in nursing. So we'll start our conversation with critical appraisal. So why look at critical appraisal through an epistemic justice lens? In nursing education, we often teach students to evaluate evidence using standardized frameworks like CASP or the Cochrane checklist, for example. And while these tools, of course, are valuable, they also are rooted in positivist traditions that privilege quantitative, empiric, and peer-reviewed evidence. And the problem here is that when we only teach students to value evidence through these frameworks, we can inadvertently also teach them to devalue other legitimate forms of knowledge, like community knowledge, lived experience knowledge, indigenous epistemologies, relational epistemologies, etc. So these frameworks don't encourage students to critically question necessarily what counts as evidence or whose voices are missing from the evidence base. From an epistemic justice perspective, then, This isn't a pedagogical gap so much as an ethical issue. When we fail to interrogate how dominant frameworks reinforce hierarchies of evidence, we perpetuate harm by excluding knowledge systems that better reflect the realities of the many communities and the people that, again, we're trying to serve and help and care for. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about two-eyed seeing here. So Ebdaway-Damuk, which is commonly known in Western academic spaces as two-eyed seeing, is a Mi'kmaq way of knowing shared with the Academy by Elder Albert Marshall. It's important to understand that Ebdaway-Damuk is not something Elder Marshall created himself, but rather a centuries-old Mi'kmaq teaching, philosophy, and way of being that belongs to the Mi'kmaq people. Elder Marshall is a philosopher himself, working within Western institutions, and he helped to articulate how Indigenous ways of knowing and being can help make our institutions more equitable and inclusive and just. And unfortunately, in academia, two-eyed seeing is often co-opted, so being used in academia superficially, symbolically, or methodologically without understanding its relational, historical, and ethical depth in its original meaning. Many interpret it as a call for balance between Western and Indigenous knowledges, but its origins were not about balance. They were about relationality, survival, and a collective responsibility. So, two-eyed seeing emerged along the east coast of Turtle Island when Mi'kmaq peoples and European settlers first met. It was a teaching about consideration, to learn from all ways of knowing and then act in a way that was best for the people. This approach was inherently about relationship, humility, and community well-being, not dominance or equivalence. In academic context, two-eyed seeing is not binary. Binaries are harmful because they oversimplify complex relationships. Instead, two-eyed seeing in academic context really calls us to learn deeply across knowledge systems and to practice contextual discernment, choosing what is most appropriate and ethical for the situation or the community that we're seeking to serve when addressing health issues as nurses. So by applying Ebdaway-Damuk to our critical appraisal practices then, this means expanding what counts as evidence. It asks us to value not only empirical studies, but also relational, experiential, and land-based knowledges, recognizing how each could contribute to understanding health and well-being. It also crucially is about creating space for Indigenous and other equity deserving scholars to develop and share their methods within the well-resourced, legitimized academic environments. And it is about embedding advocacy in methodology, as Faye shared when she was positioning herself. So changing not just how we generate knowledge, but who is allowed to be a legitimate knower and who is supported to do that work. So in a sense, then two-eyed seeing here can offer a sense of responsibility to transform academic spaces so that all ways of knowing can thrive and inform knowledge production for what is best for the people that it is seeking to serve.
Great. So with that in mind, to illustrate how we approach teaching critical appraisal from two perspectives, and we aren't teaching two-eyed seeing specifically, that wouldn't be appropriate for us, but we are inspired by that ability to be teaching from these two different perspectives and using Western ways of knowing and encouraging a broader understanding of inclusivity in terms of bringing that into our critical appraisal practices. especially as they're informed by epistemic justice. So Ashley and I wanted to share an example of how we've done this two perspectives in terms of our critical appraisal teaching approach. And so we've taught this in a graduate nursing context and a medicine class. So in these sessions, the students explored two ways of engaging in critical appraisal. And we began with this prompt for context for them. So we told them you're caring for a patient postpartum and they're asking for information about safe sleep practices. Where do you look for this information? And we told them that we'd be starting with a traditional approach to critical appraisal here. So this was the exercise that we gave them. You can see up here on the slide. Students examined several resources. So we had them look at a scholarly article. We had them look at a Canadian Joint Policy Statement on safe sleep, and also a Dynamed article on sudden infant death syndrome. And we asked them to skim each resource to kind of get a general sense of their purpose, recommendations, and conclusions. And we then asked them to review a couple of the critical appraisal tools, so CASP and JBI critical appraisal tools that were relevant to these resources. We asked students to reflect on what these tools prompted them to consider about each source. So we weren't asking them to carry out a full appraisal of the resources they're looking at, but instead we were encouraging the students to really think about, what kinds of things do these tools prompt you to examine in a resource? All right. So we followed that up with a brief discussion about these traditional critical appraisal tools, and we asked them how they think the tools might help support them to determine the quality of knowledge to inform their evidence-based practice. And Ashley, do you have more to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in doing so, what we were trying to demonstrate to students was why tools are important and that they have value in assessing peer-reviewed works that inform their evidence-based practice. But we also wanted to demonstrate to students in using this approach that there are no real critical appraisal tools for some of the commonly leaned on practice guidelines like UpToDate and Dynamed. And we're not being then, because there are no critical appraisal tools that exist for those things, taught to question those forms of knowledge. And we are kind of indirectly then teaching students to hold those types of tools as truths.
Right. So yeah, so that conversation with them around those critical appraisal tools really kind of set the stage for the next part of the session. It gave students space to recognize the strengths of the tools grounded in Western science, as Ashley said, which is an important foundation for them. But by starting there, we also were aiming to create a space to broaden the conversation and begin thinking about what these traditional critical appraisal tools might leave out. So to guide that reflection, we introduced them to this framework of harms that you see on the slide, which is the focus, by the way, of Chapter 5 in the open educational resource we shared with you, and there's a QR code link that will take you to Chapter 5 if you'd like. And the framework shows different categories of potential harm or epistemic injustice. One of the kind of key points here is that these harms can be caused and perpetuated by any type of knowledge holder. So we can use this framework ideally to evaluate any type of source. And so here we show the 5 types of harms, which I'll just go over quickly here. So profit over people, theft of knowledge, misuse or falsification of authority, exclusion, deletion, and censorship, and harmful terminology and bigotry. And then we did add an extra category that considers AI-generated knowledge and its potential harms as well.
So we wanted to just share this video as one of the videos we use with students as a tool to show them how systemic racism becomes embedded in our disciplinary knowledge and how this is a form of epistemic injustice when that knowledge becomes enacted in practice.
I'm telling the truth. There's no systemic racism that I've experienced here in America. What system is racist?
Whew. We gotta dive in because, man, I have an example. My name's Dr. Joel, the Medical Mythbuster, and today let's talk about systemic racism in medicine. To do that, I want to use the example of one specific device called a spirometer. Spirometry is a test that doctors use to measure how healthy your lungs are. It's used for conditions like asthma and COPD. But for decades, if you were Black or Asian, your test results were automatically adjusted downwards, making it harder to be diagnosed with different conditions. But to understand how that device plays into systemic racism, we have to rewind through history, starting in 1795. It was then that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, wrote in notes on the state of Virginia without evidence that enslaved Africans had weaker lungs than white people. Then in 1846 came along English surgeon John Hutchinson, who created the spirometer. He made it as a useful medical tool for measuring lung disease and military fitness. In the United States, a Louisiana doctor named Samuel Cartwright took that tool and used it on enslaved people. He claimed that the spirometer proved that Thomas Jefferson was right, that black people had lower lung capacity. He even argued that slavery was good for them because forced labor supposedly revitalized their lungs. But here's where the systemic part comes into play. Instead of rejecting the myth, medicine absorbed it. By the 20th century, spirometers came with something called a race correction. If you were black, your lung results were automatically lowered by 10 to 15%, and if you were Asian, by 4 to 6%. In fact, up until 2021, up to date, the world's most utilized medical reference by doctors still said that black patients had lower lung function as if it were a biological fact. That race correction meant that what was labeled abnormal for a white patient could be labeled normal for a black or Asian patient. That led to misdiagnoses, delayed treatments, denied disability claims, and less lung transplants. And the worst part, most doctors didn't even realize that race was adjusting values because it was built directly into the machine. It wasn't until 2022 that the Global Lung Function Initiative released race-neutral equations. And in 2023, the American Thoracic Society recommended a race-neutral approach to reading the pulmonary function tests. Some places are only now just phasing them out. That's what systemic racism is. It's not just one patient being dismissed by the healthcare system. It's racist ideas from 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson's words, Samuel Cartwright's pseudoscience, being built into a machine and shaping healthcare for generations. Examples like these go far beyond medicine. Be sure to follow, like, and share because there's a lot more myths to bust.
So we introduced that particular video to students because we really like how it speaks to up to date and how this information is in those places. Now, to prepare them to then apply the framework of harms after we provide example like that, we also brought in the case study that we share with them a little bit and provided a little bit more context. So we shared a few slide back. We originally told them that you're caring for a patient postpartum and they're asking for information about safe sleep practices. But we wanted to give a little bit more information about the client and how that might change the knowledge that they're seeking to guide their evidence-based practice in a way that is culturally humble. So the case itself, when we expanded it, is focused on, because this was medicine, a family physician, but we actually do it in nursing as well. They're an 18-year-old postpartum patient. They're in a 6-week follow-up visit. They're a newcomer to Canada from Mombasa, Kenya. At their visit, they mentioned that they live in a 2-bedroom apartment with 9 family members. They do have a desire for a larger space to accommodate their needs. There are financial constraints among their families. There's a lot of challenges within their family around. Many of them are working very hard to get a Canadian education, as some of their credentials they were not considered legitimate from Kenyan contexts. And towards the end of the visit, the patient does share that they are sharing a twin bed with their 13-year-old sister and that they are very interested in learning about co-sleeping and breastfeeding and what safe infant sleep might look like in Canadian contexts.
All right. So to get them started into this epistemic justice informed approach to critical appraisal, we begin by kind of walking them through the framework of harms, and I'm going to do the same here. So in the classes we taught, we asked the students to refer back to those 3 articles that we had initially given them. So the one on like the scholarly article, the Dynamed article, and then the Canadian Joint Policy Statement. But this time we're asking them to evaluate using this framework of harms. So I'm just going to start with the first harm that we have here, which is profit over people. This harm recognizes that Euro-Western systems value knowledge as a commodity, so something that can be bought or sold. But the buying or selling of knowledge can cause harm when the goal is to maximize profit rather than to care for the knowledge holders or to meaningfully contribute to discussion around a topic. So what we have them consider in thinking about whether a source perpetuates this type of harm is who owns or profits from this source, who else benefits when these ideas are shared or this source is used, and who is this source for or who's sharing or using it. So Ashley is going to give an example of like where that harm showed up within the resources that we were sharing with the learners.
Yeah, so for profit over people, this is an example that we shared with students where one source students were evaluating was Dynamed, which we had mentioned, and the Dynamed entry specifically on safe infant sleep. Now, here we presented a screenshot to students that actually highlighted potential conflicts of interest in Dynamed content. And this prompted a great discussion around questions such as who owns Dynamed and who has access to this knowledge, and how might ownership or financial interests influence the information presented on Dynamed that informs your practice.
All right, so the next harm that we walk them through is theft of knowledge. So in this harm, we recognize that some people, institutions, and companies use knowledge without proper permission from the original creators or stewards of that knowledge. And this may also include not recognizing unique cultural contexts for seeking permission to access knowledge, so including Indigenous knowledges. So to reflect on whether a source perpetuates this type of harm, researchers can ask, do they credit where their ideas come from or who influenced them? And are they sharing ideas or knowledge that is sacred, private, or culturally appropriated?
And the third harm is misuse or falsification of authority. This harm asks us to contemplate the fact that authority can mean many things. In some cases, individuals falsely present themselves as experts for personal gain as well, or even other motives. So, in other cases, misuse of authority can be more subtle and difficult to detect. Now, to reflect on whether a source perpetuates this type of harm, researchers can ask, is the authority or creator considered knowledgeable on this subject? Do they have training, education, permission, lived experience, or applicable credentials to the topic at hand? If speaking about a specific community, does the authority identify their positionality? And what do other trusted people say about this author or this creator? The next harm is exclusion, deletion, and censorship. So the key ideas here is that some people may deliberately remove or hide certain knowledge, only present half a story, or cherry pick ideas so that we don't get the full picture. This type of epistemic injustice can reduce the quality of the evidence we are drawing on and reinforce social control and lead to the spread of mis, dis, and malinformation. So, to reflect on whether a source perpetuates this type of harm, researchers can ask, is the creator or source using out-of-date information? And if so, is that acknowledged? Can you trace their claims, quotes, or media? Does extracted information support their claims? Are you able to fact check their ideas? Are any being exaggerated or manipulated or omitted or cherry picked or taken out of context? And who else is saying the same thing? What other coverage can you find on the same topic or the same idea? So, an example that we actually give on exclusion, deletion, and censorship when teaching students about this is Hypertension Canada's clinical practice guidelines, where in their clinical practice guidelines, there are quite a few recommendations that mention Black patients. And here's just one screenshot, one example where they say an ACE inhibitor should not be prescribed to Black patients, and that this is grade B level evidence. However, you can't determine where this recommendation came from if you look at the resource list. Not a single citation in the resource list mentions the terms race or ethnicity or Black. So this is an example of how we cannot trace their claim and that we cannot actually fact check their idea. We then go to the literature and try to fact check their ideas in a different way. And since this information is not clearly cited in their guideline, we try to support learners to find other articles like this. So this article is titled Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Hypertension, Barriers and Opportunities to Improve Blood Pressure Control. This is a journal that was published in 2023 from the Current in Cardiology, and it has an impact factor of 3.3. So might be an example of where someone may say the same thing as Hypertension Canada's guidelines, but let's look at what is said within the article. In the article, we also show students a section called Genetic and Physiologic Differences, and we would spend a lot more time than I will with you today in doing so and unpacking each sentence, but I'll just give one example of one sentence where the section of the article is about genetic and physiologic differences, and we talked through how they are citing things. So this sentence says, dietary potassium supplementation can significantly reduce the degree of salt sensitivity among non-Hispanic Blacks. Now, this comes from an article that is actually titled, No Evidence of Racial Disparities in Blood Pressure Salt Sensitivity When Potassium Intake Exceeds Levels Recommended in the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. The second half of this sentence says, a randomized control trial found that the addition of 80 millimoles per day of potassium reduced systolic blood pressure by approximately 7 millimoles of mercury. But if you actually look at what was cited here, it was from an article from 1996, where the title was The Effect of Potassium Supplementation on Blood Pressure in African Americans on a Low Potassium Diet. The entire cohort of this randomized control trial was Black Americans, 87 of them to be exact. But the way that this was constructed and cherry-picked into this article was presented as such that this was controlled with white individuals, right? So these examples that we unpack with students really show how it is easy to exaggerate and manipulate and cherry-pick and take out of context to serve your underlying argument of your paper. And then we also support students then interrogating how did this information get into this journal and with an impact factor of 3.3 or the entire Canadian guideline used for antihypertension medication prescription. We talk about power that reviewers and editors hold in legitimizing knowledge and also their positionalities and how their positionalities might have made them blinded to harmful knowledge production practices. And because they have also been taught that hypertension is different themselves genetically for Black folks. And this is not actually truth. This is knowledge that has been baked into the truth of the discipline in that there is apparently a biological fact of difference. And so we hope that in detailing this, unpacking this work really supports students kind of to uptake that critical lens towards the post-positivist empiric work that they're engaged with.
All right, so the next harm that we talk about is harmful terminology and bigotry. So this harm is acknowledging that people can be racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. And we need to be aware of how these forms of bigotry can manifest in the knowledge we may be engaging with so that we can avoid perpetuating these harms. So to reflect on whether a source perpetuates this type of harm, we ask students to consider things like what words or language are they using to describe people? Do any terms raise red flags for them? For example, are they using slurs or other harmful terminology? Why would harmful language be used by that source or person? All sources have edges or limitations. So does this one hold problematic or harmful biases? Are the biases and limitations named, acknowledged, or addressed in some way? And is the source or person attempting to hide or minimize their biases? So for this harm, we actually wanted to give a positive example of a study addressing its potential for harm. So one of the questions we just saw was, are biases and limitations named, addressed, and acknowledged? And there's a screenshot on my slide that you'll see here. of the participants section from the scholarly article that we had the students look at. And we see some issues with the study demographics. So we know in this case, the participants recruited were by and large white, married, insured, and college educated. So there's some clear bias in the results that they're going to get. And the authors do actually draw attention to this limitation and the way it decreases generalizability, as you can see on the slide here. So we did note that this isn't to say that like these authors have acknowledged their limitation and therefore like this is a great article or something like that. Ideally, this issue would have been addressed at the recruitment stage. But this limitation being acknowledged does show awareness and also hopefully helps us to recognize problems with relying too heavily on this one form of evidence. So again, it can be a good kind of starting point for researchers considering like whose voices are missing, what other types of knowledge do we need to seek out.
So finally, the last part of the framework is evaluating AI-generated content. We could probably have a whole webinar on this. But this harm acknowledges that there can be inherent issues with knowledge that comes from non-human entities like AI tools and platforms. To reflect on potential harms coming from AI tools and platforms, researchers can ask, who owns this company? What is their mandate? Is that information even available? How was the model trained? Is that information available? What are the boundaries of this model? For example, what is it allowed to talk about? And is this information also available? A final note on this exercise, we just really wanted to reiterate that this activity wasn't about saying one way of appraising knowledge is better or worse, but we really wanted to just highlight that traditional appraisal tools may be really useful for considering study quality, but not as useful for considering the systems, platforms, or social contexts shaping knowledge itself. And so we just threw a lot at you, but we wanted to give you a few minutes to discuss in the chat. We don't have Heather here, so we don't have access to Mentimeter, but we wanted to ask you, how can you integrate an epistemic justice lens in your evidence-based practice as a nurse educator? Or how can you mentor nursing students to use this lens in their critical appraisal of evidence? So we'll give you a few minutes to just kind of share your thoughts in the chat. So someone said, by sharing some of the examples that you provided in this workshop. Well, thank you. We have lots more if you want. Kristen wrote, I think this is really important in our work as nursing educators and my own PhD work too. I'm concerned at the rate at which students are supposed to draw knowledge from resources and apply it to the development of their nursing knowledge and practice. I like the idea of slowing down and taking time to review and critically appraise the resources we are drawing knowledge from before applying it. Yeah, I love that. I think slowing down is like a great way to describe that. Amy says teaching them to take time to absorb evidence without cherry picking evidence for their papers themselves. There. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I mean, it was I in going through that process myself, that hypertension Canada guideline, I learned. So I was looking with our with Katie and Marin, another librarian colleague, where we were picking apart the reference list, going, where did this come from? And then we started searching articles. That article that I picked was like one of the first ones that came up in, Scopus. And when I did the historic citation chain, I was quite flabbergasted in terms of what I was discovering. Amanda says, unfortunately, I cannot say the second half of the webinar, but I look forward to watching others. Okay, thank you. And then Kristen also says, creating some space where students can ask questions about these resources they engage with. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. Okay, well, we wanted to also show you a video about what students are saying about this when they learn. This video is actually in our book in chapter 6, but it's a student, Ashley Campbell, that was a knowledge synthesis student, a master's of knowledge synthesis, master's of nursing student in our program, who was paired with me for their knowledge synthesis work. And I worked a lot with them about integrating epistemic justice into their nursing practice. So these are a bit of their reflections. Let you play.
I was trained as a nurse in Western academia, rooted in the biomedical model of healthcare. So I was inherently trained with bias that peer-reviewed research and scholarly literature was the gold standard for developing my philosophies of care and best practice guidelines. So I often have to push myself beyond what's familiar, which is those like journal articles, protocols, best practice guidelines, to ask for what views are missing. So who wrote it? What are their motive? What's missing from this information? Whose perspectives are missing? And what may be erased or overlooked because it doesn't fit within the Western healthcare model. I think that I need to stay open, I need to stay curious, I need to continue to evaluate and ask those critical questions of what's missing, who's saying that this is the best case scenario, and what population is that serving, and what population is missing, what viewpoints are missing, and how do we incorporate those into making better decisions. So I think just being able to critically look at sources and analyze for those gaps, analyze what population it's serving, analyze what populations are disadvantaged further because of this position statement or guideline or best practice standard.
It's really interesting when you
So if you want to see a lot of other people reflect on this, we have lots of videos of that. But we really wanted to share Ashley's perspective because she was a student on a graduate journey that entered graduate school from a post-positivist lens that informed her practice. And we engaged with her and we went on a journey together, working on how we could bring epistemic justice lenses to evidence-based practice for critical appraisal for our graduate students. And I think her sharing her unlearning journey is also really meaningful to see some of the change that this teaching has had on people that are currently practicing nurse practitioners. Okay, that was one of 3. So we're just unloading on you today some information here, but now we're going to talk about applying an epistemic justice lens to evidence synthesis.
All right. So, in my work as a librarian, I support knowledge synthesis, and Ashley, my librarian colleague Marin, and I have been working to integrate an epistemic justice lens into how we approach systematic and scoping reviews. And this came up kind of for us because of an issue we noticed. So I'll just quickly go over that. So as you know, probably, reviews should be based on a broad, comprehensive search that captures all the evidence on a topic. But what's traditionally considered broad isn't actually broad. For example, peer-reviewed literature is prioritized in these types of projects, and the gray literature search is often considered supplementary and often limited to clinical trials, theses and dissertations, and conference abstracts if it's done at all. And this is partly because the Cochrane Handbook requires database searching, but it doesn't require gray literature. It just recommends that you do a gray literature search. So we know that the gray literature search is often skipped, especially by researchers on a tight timeline, for example, because of coursework. Plus, there's also some debate in scholarship around what actually constitutes gray literature. So for instance, in some contexts, a blog post might be considered gray literature, but in other contexts, it might not be. So on top of all of this, we also know that there are voices and perspectives that aren't being considered or included at all within what we're thinking of as gray literature. So the question we're trying to answer here is, how do we expand the search for evidence to recognize, include, and value diverse knowledge systems and perspectives?
So just to sit with this discussion a little longer, because it might be like taking us out of our comfort zone. When we really think about evidence synthesis, the goal is to identify a norm, right? To gather, to compare, to distill the most common, the most consistent, the most reliable across literature. But if the norm in academia continues to be shaped by white, settler, Eurocentric, heteronormative, cisgendered, and able-bodied voices, for example, then evidence synthesis as a method will inevitably reproduce and legitimize and further elevate those dominant narratives. So this means that equity deserving voices, like voices from racialized individuals, newcomer communities, women, two-spirit, trans, non-binary people, as just some examples, will remain marginalized. Their knowledge is often framed as outlier data, as anecdotal evidence or gray literature, rather than integral to understanding the health and well-being of all individuals. So I first came to this work by noticing a pattern when reviewing evidence synthesis on topics about health equity, about trauma and violence informed care, or about gender affirming care practice. And I really realized how often the conclusion of evidence synthesis were simply, we don't know enough about the experiences of these communities. But it wasn't that that knowledge didn't exist. It was that our methods were designed to not see it. Traditional evidence synthesis privileges those peer-reviewed empiric sources, as Katie has mentioned, but it also discounts community reports, advocacy documents, lived experience narratives, and that's where that type of knowledge lives. And so today we wanted to share our developing approach. We're not saying it's correct 100%. We're still working on it ourselves. And we've been working a lot with graduate students on it as well, in terms of how we're bringing an epistemic justice lens into evidence synthesis. And this means expanding on what counts as evidence, interrogating whose voices are amplified or silenced in our data that we're collecting, and ensuring that our knowledge production practices include and center these narratives that are often marginalized. Now, this shift is not just methodological. I wanted to point out too, for Katie and Marin and myself, it's ethical. It challenges us to create synthesis processes that don't erase difference, but learn from this and include them and include these diverse voices so that nursing knowledge that we are generating truly does reflect the full diversity of humanity and the people that we're looking to serve.
All right. So just so you know, just for some further context, when we first started this work, one of the things we wanted to do was see what literature was out there around, taking these sort of knowledge, justice, equity informed approaches to systematic and scoping reviews. And what we discovered very quickly is that there's not a huge amount of information available out there. That said, I did want to just highlight one resource that we found that has really helped shape our thinking around epistemic justice and knowledge synthesis. And alongside the OER, this is something that's kind of been a foundational paper for us. So it's a paper from Public Health Ontario called Overview of Equity Informed Approaches to Evidence Synthesis. And it includes a really useful table that outlines the main steps in a knowledge synthesis project, along with suggestions for how to bring equity informed approaches into each stage. So I definitely recommend giving it a read. Our focus today will be on how we've been applying a knowledge justice lens, primarily in the searching stage, since that's where most of our current work has been. As Ashley said, we're kind of still in the development. But the article also covers some other stages like screening, synthesis, and knowledge sharing. So also you can find that in the OneDrive folder using that QR code.
So in our evidence synthesis work specifically, one of the tools we've been really applying is an epistemic justice lens to is our voices flower that we have shared in our prior workshops. So for those of you that are not familiar, the voices flower that we've discussed, it's present in chapter 3 of our OER. It really reimagines how we think about authority and expertise in knowledge production. Instead of ranking evidence through a hierarchy like the traditional levels of evidence pyramid that we shared earlier, the Voices Flower really encourages us to ask different questions like, whose voices do we need to fully understand this issue? It prompts us to pause and think intersectionally about who holds relevant knowledge: researchers, practitioners, community members, and people with lived experience. Rather than privileging one kind of evidence over another, this model helps us value multiple ways of knowing, recognizing that each offers a unique and necessary perspective. So, using this tool in our evidence synthesis approaches to help students and researchers reconsider who they see as experts and ensure the process of gathering evidence reflects diversity and relational and inclusive voices has been really helpful in teaching people where to seek and search for voices.
All right, so to start us off, I just wanted to share how I would approach a consult with a graduate student or a faculty member interested in taking this approach. So one thing that we just want to reiterate again is that we're not removing the scholarly search. We're still doing sort of the traditional scholarly search in databases where you create your very comprehensive search string. So this is part of a search strategy shared with permission from a graduate student who we're working with currently. But again, the crux of the knowledge justice informed approach is asking what's missing from this, what's missing from this type of very comprehensive search, but the search that's only happening within the databases. And to ensure the scholarly search isn't becoming the be all and end all, I've been using an adapted methodology for finding gray literature to walk researchers through finding all types of voices. And so these are some of the general steps that we've been using so far. And then typically I'll also use a template like this one, like the one you see on the slide, to help them identify the types of knowledge holders or knowledge creators you see represented on that voices flower that Ashley went through. So I work with them to help them brainstorm whose voices they might need to find on any particular topic.
So we just wanted to go through an example together around abortion care and how we have taught this previously to students and in other spaces as well. So if you were advising a graduate student in their early stages of a research project and their topic is about abortion care education among nurse practitioners in Canada, and the student is now expressing interest in incorporating a knowledge justice approach, how might you do that? And so we've used the Voices Flower, which I showed you earlier and you've seen before if you've been part of our other workshops, but we use it to help the student reconsider their evidence for abortion care, the topic that they have selected. So they can look at their methodology and kind of follow this framework. And their gray literature to explore how might they incorporate some of the other voices that they are seeking. Looking at some of the petals that include other knowledge holders, and I just wanted to walk you through each petal and what that might include. So the first is power holders. This is governments, lawmakers, academic and healthcare institutions or regulatory bodies. So an example of that might be a Government of Canada website that is called Abortion Care in Canada. So that's where that kind of voice might fall. If we're seeking voices from arm's length observers, who are those people? These are journalists, academics that are like us. They are research institutions that observe and report on phenomena without necessarily being directly embedded in its experience. An example we wanted to share here was actually a journalist, Jennifer Ferreira from CTV. They had an article that they had shared, Not a Uniform Experience, Women Share Their Triumphs and Concerns for accessing Abortion Care in Canada. And I wanted to share that example because another example that would fall in this category is much of the work that we would see in the peer-reviewed literature, and that's easy for us largely to understand. I also want to point out that there is a level of intersectionality here, and that you might be an arm's length observer, but you also could hold lived experience in the framework of the voices. So that's just something to consider as we engage with the voices that we're seeking. It's not that you fall in one category or the other. So another arm of the flower is community organizations. So these could be advocacy groups, non-for-profit agencies, indigenous governments, and community organizations. An example of this in relation to this case could be Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, which is a not-for-profit organization. Various resources and reports are accessible from them. Another example is care providers. So people like us, we're all nurses, frontline healthcare workers, traditional healers, midwives, doulas, anyone who's providing care even outside of dominant models. An example of this specifically to abortion care, we actually selected and chose to share a peer-reviewed article by somebody who was a nurse practitioner that wrote it because they are a care provider, and it was about the barriers and enablers to nurse practitioners providing medication abortion in Canada. So again, there is an intersectional element here where you can hold many voice types within this framework. And then finally, lived experience is really the epistemic center of this framework, where we are seeking out these voices in a way that is countering the silence distortions that are dominant in the knowledge structures that uphold academia. Here's one example. It's a podcast featuring speakers sharing their stories of having an abortion. The podcast itself is by Camila Okua Mendoza. It's called Abortion with Love. But really, this is about thinking, where can we find the voices of individuals that hold that experience? And often we have to seek outside, seek in places where their voices haven't had space to share. And this means we have to change the way we seek knowledge in academic contexts.
Great. So we also wanted to speak a little bit to lived experience and ethics, because we know when we're seeking out lived experience online and things like that, that there are ethical questions that come into that conversation. So in systematic or scoping reviews of peer-reviewed research, consent for academic use is generally covered by publication ethics. But when we draw on the types of sources that Ashley was just talking about, so like podcasts, blogs, or social media, particularly for personal stories, we recognize that those creators didn't necessarily expect or intend academic citation, even though they are making their stories or their experiences publicly available. So there aren't necessarily easy answers to this, and we're still figuring out approaches in learning. But so far we've been using and following the Association of Internet Researchers guidelines for considering ethics in relation to online lived experience. And so that's what you're seeing on this slide is kind of some of the major highlights from these guidelines. And so we guide researchers to treat consent as a key question. And if you check out the open educational resource, we have a list of questions to guide them, including things like whose story is this? Would the speaker be okay with academic use? Also, just as a note for lived experience on social media, we also ask questions like, has the creator made this post shareable or downloadable? Because if not, there might be specific reasons why the creator doesn't want it to be used in another context. They might want to be controlling the environment in which they're, providing that information. And so that's something else to consider. And if there's any doubt, it's good practice to seek permission directly. So contacting knowledge experts is traditionally part of the, or can traditionally be part of the gray literature process. So part of what we're doing here is just encouraging an expansion of the idea of who would be an expert and encouraging to seek that consent when possible. All right. So once we've helped researchers identify those voices and we kind of walk them through some of the ethical considerations there, we want to give them some practical strategies for how they actually go about finding the information that they're looking for. And so these strategies are all taken from Chapter 4 of the Knowledge Justice OER. And there are 4 major ones, as you can see here. We definitely dive into these strategies a lot more in the book itself, but we'll quickly review a couple of them, starting with that first strategy there, adjusting our language. So one of the things we discuss in the OER is that language, like epistemology, is shaped by culture. And when using a knowledge justice lens, we can ask, what language does the community use to describe themselves and their knowledge? So we've kind of broken this up into externally defined terms and self-chosen terms. Externally defined terms are top-down, shaped by institutions rather than communities. And in contrast to this, self-chosen terms emerge in a bottom-up way, reflecting how people actually want to be seen and understood. So on social media, like hashtags are a really good example of this. So an example that we often give, in teaching contexts would be the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic, which was created by the autistic community to reclaim the conversation around autism from folks who maybe don't have autism, but were providing information that was harmful to the autistic community. All right, so our abortion topic that Ashley was talking about earlier actually gives a good example of the major variations that we tend to see between like the self-chosen terms that exist out there and those externally defined terms. So I've kind of given an example here of what we're looking at. So on social media, when we're seeking out community voices or lived experience voices, you might find hashtags like #ShoutYourAbortion or abortion is healthcare that challenge stigma and restrictive narratives around abortion. And we can see how much this differs from the language that's used in externally defined spaces and informal contexts, and even how much this language can differ between some of these externally defined spaces. So for example, the Canadian government tends to use terms around abortion like abortion services or reproductive rights, so framing it in that way, whereas the United States government often uses terms like abortion industry or provider. And so these distinctions matter. Things like industry, for example, can stigmatize abortion by separating it out from other healthcare services. So what we try to, speak to researchers about is that being mindful of these language choices, even though, the language choices I understand might seem minor, is an important first step in building an inclusive and intentional search strategy and being able to find the voices that you're looking for. And so a way that we can do that is by using some of these tools that exist online, for example. So I've included a few of them here for finding hashtags or how people are sharing information on social media. You might use Google Social Search or socialsearcher.com. And then you can also use something like Google Trends to track how often a particular term is being used in Google. So it kind of gives a picture of what language has become popular over time. So just something that we try to help researchers think about when they're going to seek out these voices. And then thinking about social media and lived experience specifically, once we have some of this terminology and we're doing the search for lived experience, another strategy is to borrow a common way that we see literature within academic searching, which is something called citation chaining, which you might be familiar with. So in simple terms, this is essentially when you find a good article and you use it to find other research, either by checking the references or by looking at who has cited that article since it was written. So we can do the same thing on social media, and this is something that we've been, discussing with researchers. When we find a creator sharing a valuable perspective, that can lead us to find other voices or other people who might be sharing information on that as well. So for example, we showed a video earlier from Joelle Verbel, but we have an example here too, as well as one from Dr. Sood, and their TikTok handles are there at the bottom for you. And they both engage in these kinds of conversations online. So Joelle, for example, here is responding to a video he was tagged in, while Dr. Sood is stitching another video about endometriosis, and he shares his take on a research article. So these kinds of interactions do give us an insight into these conversations that are happening within communities, kind of like how citations are showing conversations within scholarly research. And then that brings us to the next and final strategy, which is building an evidence suite. So especially when using lived experience voices, one of the things that we really want to encourage people to think about is seeing evidence in a broader, more relational way. So not as just isolated pieces of evidence, but as part of a larger suite or a larger collection. So using social media as evidence means recognizing that no single post exists in a vacuum. And to make sense of it, we need to understand how it connects to other posts, to broader conversations, and to the communities from which it emerges. So context and community are really critical within these platforms. And so these reflection questions that you see on the slide are intended essentially to help with that and allow us to keep building that evidence suite. So things like, who is the creator referencing, tagging, or amplifying? Who are they in community with? Are their voices missing from this conversation? That kind of thing. All right. And very briefly, I just wanted to return us to the framework of harms, just to say that the evaluation process is, of course, important when we're working with researchers too. We gave the example of using this in kind of a critical appraisal way in a classroom, but this is also something that we're encouraging when we're doing like research consults, things like that. Because we do recognize that misdis and malinformation are big problems, especially with online content and online forms of knowledge. And so one of the things that we're often speaking about is that we're not sort of telling people just like go off and find whatever source you want and use it. We want to encourage them to practice mindful exclusion and be mindful about, whose voices they are sharing and whose voices they are seeking out. So that's something that we just wanted to reflect on.
So just like the framework of harms that we shared that Katie just shared, where once in their search strategies, the graduate students have found all of the voices that they would like and evaluated them on the framework of harms, we also have them do an additional layer of evaluation where we get them to actually evaluate their entire suite of evidence as a whole rather than as an individual voice or individual source in terms of assessing it for inclusivity and diversity. So again, here, there's more in the OER about this, but some of the questions we might encourage students and researchers to consider when evaluating the full suite of evidence that you've collected to inform yourself is you might include, does your evidence include multiple worldviews? So, do sources not extensively represent Euro-Western culture and epistemology, for example? Does your evidence include diverse and intersectional creators? Do you have authors and creators that represent a wide range of positionalities and experiences surrounding gender and ethnicity, sexuality, etc.? And also, does your evidence include a range of diverse knowledge sources? So, do you have story or narrative, land-based knowledge, creative expression, scholarly research, government information, public policy? So again, this approach is just really intentional in terms of no one piece of information is going to provide us a fulsome understanding so much as we are looking and seeking voices from diverse perspectives so that we are generating knowledge that is inclusive. And so we'll get you to do another reflection in the chat about what we just talked about in terms of what challenges might you foresee in mentoring students to engage in inclusive evidence synthesis methodologies, or how can you enact epistemic justice in your knowledge production practices, particularly when using evidence synthesis methodologies? So we'll give you a minute to chew on that. So thanks, Jan, for starting it off. Jan said, I can utilize what I've learned in these webinars when collecting sources for a topic I wish to present to my class to challenge not only my way of thinking and knowing, but theirs as well. I have a lot of unlearning to do. Well, me too, Jen. I think it's a journey for everyone, right? And so I love that you're just so vulnerable in sharing that. And what you're doing is also beautifully replicating and tying in what we talked about last week, where a lot of this work in a classroom setting pedagogically is working with students as partners and being vulnerable alongside them. So thank you for sharing that. Andrea says it can be difficult to know the positionality of a knowledge holder author. Absolutely agree. It could invite assumptions that are hard to validate. I love that as a critique in all of this as well. Kristen says, now everybody's answering. Kristen says, I was struggling to complete a scoping review as a PhD student because I felt like it didn't really fit with my focus of research, treaty-informed ethics and nursing education. However, I found a resource to apply a decolonial and relational approach to literature review that includes literature learnings shared in visits and experiences and sources informed by mentors oh, it's jumping around. Instead of looking through traditional database searches. Thank you for sharing that. I'd be really interested to learn about that too. And then Joanna says, I think unpacking what is deemed scholarly versus how we incorporate intersectionality when engaging in research is an ongoing conversation and needs to be more than a one-off conversation as we are all learning together. Love that. Thank you for sharing, everyone. For the purposes of time, we will continue. And we just wanted to share really briefly about our experiences and then also what the students are saying. So as faculty mentoring students, if I were to answer this question, it's exciting, but it's also pretty scary. One of the most significant barriers for myself is that there's no lack of established guidance. So there's not a lot of literature on this. And that means for both myself and my students, as others have highlighted in the chat, this is a process of co-learning, experimentation, and kind of inventing. It's not streamlined. And then for me, sometimes what happens is I worry that I am mentoring students in a way that could slow down their work. And there's also logistical instructional tensions here. Katie mentioned current protocol templates and ethic processes that support systematic and scoping reviews and how they rely almost exclusively on peer-reviewed sources. So when we are seeking knowledge in the margins or in the gray literature, that binary term that others everything else, like community reports and storytelling, there could be some complication here in terms of the current structures that validate and legitimize knowledge. We are really also very much taking a bottom-up approach here, embedding these values at the mentorship and instructional level, but broader systematic change and institutional transformation from a top-down systematic lens is needed. And that means things like research ethic boards and protocol templates like agree to need to change. Repositories need to be revised in terms of what they recognize and in terms of evidence synthesis. And so we'll talk a little bit about that next week, but there is a bigger picture here too. And then another layer of this I always like to name for Katie and myself is that there is a power dynamic between faculty and librarians, and that librarians do have a very deep expertise in inclusive and critical information literacy practices, but sometimes they can face barriers when mentoring students that are going to them that want to use an epistemic justice lens because perhaps the faculty that are mentoring that graduate student are not necessarily receptive to this perspective of systematic and scoping reviews. Also, we'll share with you what graduate research students are currently saying that actually Shakufe and myself are mentoring. So one of our students, Rania, her work is about health professional education and the use of inclusive and culturally safe case-based learning. And in going through this process and using this process when seeking information herself, she shared that incorporating an epistemic justice lens has really allowed her to evaluate voices and knowledge systems that are often marginalized in conventional reviews, leading to richer and more contextualized, grounded findings. It's really improved both the relevance and integrity of her work. Rania also says it has fundamentally reoriented how I see knowledge, less as something to be extracted and more as something to be co-created. I now approach research with a greater sense of humility, which I think was a beautiful learning she shared. And then finally, there's also a lot of faculty involved in this. Earlier, Katie shared a peer-reviewed protocol that another student that faculty we're working with at our school is engaging with, and the faculty themselves, Dr. Penny Trafanopoulos, they said that engaging in this work as researchers, we really have a responsibility to seek out voices that are often left out. And in doing this, this makes our findings richer and more relevant. And in turn, it creates research that's more democratic and collaborative. What's really stood out to Penny is seeing students question old assumptions and think more critically about the voices that are represented. And these moments just show how important it is for epistemic justice approaches to make research more equitable and meaningful. Okay, so we'll move on to our last section here, where we're now going to talk about approaching scholarship of teaching and learning as well as research with epistemically just methods. And I'll just reorient everybody one more time to the the empire or the hierarchy rather of epistemologies in research paradigms, and just remind us of our conversation earlier. And that this also holds true particularly for SOTL research, where traditional teaching scholarship often focuses on empiric approaches with some leanings into qualitative research. But those are not necessarily robustly represented in SOTL. And in my teaching scholarship work, and from what I have learned from Shaku Fei, I've begin to really critically interrogate my own approaches to SOTL and how might I explore inclusive methods. And this is very complicated and it takes time, and we're all learning together, as many of us have shared.
Okay, so when it comes to knowledge co-production, let's dive into a little bit of the theory of what does that mean when it comes to knowledge generation through research and evaluation. So knowledge co-production is a collaborative process through which researchers, educators, or community members with lived experiences generate that knowledge together. So this ensures that multiple ways of knowing are recognized, valued, and integrated. So this approach moved beyond that traditional expert-driven model of inquiry to prioritize relational, participatory, and equity-oriented methods that situate knowledge within its social, political, and cultural context. So collaborating with people who have the lived experience and are from the community in this process strengthen both the ethical integrity and practical relevance of knowledge. So ethically, it aligns with the principles of agency, autonomy, reciprocity, and respect, and ensure that those most affected by social inequities have a meaningful role in shaping how knowledge about their experiences is created, integrated, and mobilized. So this practice directly enacts epistemic justice because it seeks to recognize that and make space for knowledge systems that have been excluded from nursing education and research. And it also seeks to redistribute power in knowledge-making process, where co-production usually resists epistemic injustice as it seeks to create knowledge democracy. So in the context of research, co-production is often enacted through participatory action research or community-based participatory action research frameworks, where community are partners to co-define research questions, methodologies, knowledge mobilization strategies. These approaches have demonstrated effectiveness in health and social care, particularly addressing inequities and injustice through collaborative inquiries and mutual learnings. So which we will explore more shortly today. Next slide, please. However, there are some similar approaches that are less commonly applied in the scholarship of teaching and learning, where knowledge generation often remains educator-driven. So extending co-production into our scholarship of teaching and learning through curriculum co-design was something we wanted to initiate to offer that transformative potentials. It invites community members to act not as a subject of a study, but as co-educator and co-designers of the content. We ensure that educational content reflects that lived experiences and prepares our students to provide that culturally safe and socially responsive care. In our ongoing work with this team, we have begun engaging community members from equity-deserving communities and groups to learn directly from them and to see what they believe nursing students need to know and to do to create that safe space in practice. So this processes recenter community knowledge holders and keepers with lived experiences as legitimate expertise and models for students that relational, accountable, and justice-oriented partnership, which is necessary to support culturally safe care. Next slide, please.
So I have just one example of how I have been doing this more recently and learning from Faye's research program and how I might learn from her approaches, where I've received an RNEO or the Registered Nurse Association of Ontario Advanced Clinical Practice Fellowship for addressing a major gap in our curriculum around creating simulation-based opportunities that are safe, inclusive, and gender affirming. So a lot of content around sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, gender affirming care, and inclusive and safe care is increasingly present in theoretical coursework. Students do still report low confidence in terms of their ability to enact this in a simulated context. So a portion of this project that I've received funding for is actually around co-creating curriculum authentically and in a community informed way, where I am working with community members with lived experience and having them drive the content that is being shared and taught to students in a simulated context, and asking community members what they see as most relevant and what they would want nursing students to learn most about in simulated contexts to support safe healthcare spaces.
Okay. So another example that I wanted to share today is that I have received the Teaching Innovation Award from the Center for Teaching and Learning at Western University to co-create and evaluate a community-led newcomer health curriculum for the nursing undergraduate program. This project addresses a critical gap in nursing education by preparing future nurses to provide not only cultural safe care, but also trauma and violence-informed care to newcomers in Canada. So it comes from the gap that many nurses feel unprepared to navigate settlement and interpretation services, refugee health system, advocacy resources, and this became barriers that contribute to mistrust and poor health outcome for newcomer communities. To address this gap, this project connects community partners and community knowledge with scholarship of teaching and learning, a link that often missed in traditional curriculum design. So through this initiative, our nursing faculty, students, and newcomer communities in London will co-create an online learning module focused on newcomer health experiences. And this module will be piloted within the required nursing undergrad courses about social justice. So this project is another example of knowledge co-production where community members are partners, not subject, in shaping what and how students learn. Their lived experiences directly inform the content and ensure that it's culturally grounded, relevant, and ethically responsive. Again, by embedding newcomer voices in curriculum development and design, this project enact epistemic justice, as it recognized that newcomer knowledge as a source of expertise, and it's disrupt that power imbalance in curriculum development and create the space where curriculum creation is community engaged and justice oriented. Next slide, please. The module will be evaluated through surveys, focus group, and art-based assignments for students in the form of a public also art exhibition. In our last session, we have discussed that to enact epistemic justice in our teaching practices, we must critically reflect on our pedagogical approaches to assessment. So we discussed if we are only asking the student to produce knowledge in traditional empiric forms like written assignments and presentation, we are also signaling and role modeling that hierarchy of epistemologies that we have discussed. By providing a student here opportunities to develop diverse knowledge forms in their learning, we are also teaching them that there is value in the different and diverse knowledge systems. So we asked the student in this project to create art as a form of knowledge and their learning. So this project enacts social justice, and it is reciprocal in that members and other health organization, community health organization, are invited to participate in the final art exhibition as well, where students will come forward and showcase their learning from the knowledge they have been gifted by the community members. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of the student assignment from last year, which not particularly was focused on newcomer, but it was more about social justice issues in Canada. So we asked them through that innovative assignment called On Essay Assignment to invite the students to explore social justice issues through that original artistic creation, such as painting, poetry, sculpture making, and other medium like blending creativity with critical thinking and course learning. The student learn in this particular project about newcomer health through the module and will draw on diverse sources, including lived experiences, academic literature, and organizational resources. So the art-based knowledge production is intended to convey a clear message and emotional impact and a strong connection to the issue. So the creative process is documented, and a student are required to complete the reflection piece to explain their artwork meanings and how the assignment enacted and enhanced their understanding of social justice issues. In this case, the student shared some painting about climate change, impact of climate change also on Indigenous lands, and mental health issues during postpartum and pregnancy for marginalized population. You can see on the slides. Next slide, please. I also wanted to narrow down a little bit to research methodology and to just discuss what are the common research methodology in this realm of co-creation and co-production of knowledge. So anti-colonial methodology and art-based methodologies is something we wanted to discuss today in the scholarship of teaching and learning. To provide some of the principles and example of this. So in general, art-based methodology are research approaches that that use creative forms such as photography, storytelling, poetry, drawing, or performances. The aim is to explore and share people's lived experiences, and they also help communicate knowledge in expressive, accessible, and emotionally meaningful way that goes beyond that traditional academic method, such as two examples here we're going to review together is photo voice and digital storytelling. Anti-colonial methodologies are research approaches that challenge colonial power and knowledge systems, and centers the voices, experiences, and worldview of the marginalized people, and particularly Indigenous people as well, to produce knowledge that supports self-determination, equity, and social justice. Some examples are Indigenous research methodologies, community-based research, and land-based research. Some of the principles of art-based methodologies are, as we discussed, are creative expression as learning and legitimate knowledge production, where we support learners to use visual art, poetry, music, photography, storytelling to explore their health concept and social determinant of health. We might also consider this in our own knowledge production practices. On essay assignment that you saw some examples, enacting empathy and cultural humility, where we focus our scholarship methods on art-based activities to foster that emotional engagement and deeper understanding of the lived experiences. Knowledge mobilization through art, where we can consider how we might share the knowledge we create in our scholarship, like in the form of student-created works in exhibition or digital platform to promote dialogue among learners, community, and health professionals. An inclusive assessment, which we have discussed previously as promoting multiple forms of evidence of expression beyond text-based output that challenge that rigid academic norms. And critical pedagogy integration, that we can combine art-based method with social framework to integrate health and inequities and system operations. Some of the principles of anti-colonial methodologies are about centering equity deserving voices, where we prioritize knowledge from community historically and currently excluded from health education, challenging dominant epistemology, where we question Eurocentric frameworks and biomedical dominance, and integrate multiple ways of knowing. We're constructing our own approaches as well. Decolonizing curriculum through our scholarship work, embedding principle of equity, diversity, inclusion, epistemic justice in the curriculum design, reciprocity and community engagement, critical reflexivity, and finally consider how we might also support transformative structural change when we will discuss in our next webinar as well. So art-based participatory methodology are usually used to build more collaborative relationship with community, as we discussed, and this approach helps us to center those lived experiences, not just as data, but also as expertise. This model also shows how we work in parallel with community members, moving through key stages like co-creation, trust building, reflection, and these two intertwined paths, as you can see in the slide, that represent researchers and participants journeying together. For example, as researchers are framing question or going through a skills training, our community co-creators are sharing priorities, shaping the direction of our work, and building their own capacities. It's a two-way process grounded in mutual learning and respect. This was really important, not just for informing our action, but also for promoting healing, raising awareness, and making a space for the voices that are too often left out. To do that, we knew our approach had to be more dynamic and truly collaborative. Next slide, please. Here, I want to share also one example of art-based methodology that I use in my program of research, participatory photography. Participatory photography is a method that empowers individuals to use cameras to document their lives, community, and everyday experiences. Rather than being the subject of research, participants become co-creator of knowledge. They take pictures, share them in small groups, and reflect on what that image represents, that sparkle dialogue and ultimately collective action. This method emphasized local knowledge, lived experiences, and community-led insights. It's not about taking a perfect picture, it's about telling a meaningful stories from their own perspective. One structured form of this method is photo voice, which was developed in rural China with women and later formalized by Caroline Wang and Marianne Boris in 1992. The term photo voice also is an acronym that stands for voicing our individual and collective experiences. It draws on feminist theory, critical pedagogy, and documentary photography, and invites us to ask not just what we see, but why it matters. So at the end, a true public exhibition, dialogue, and photo voice and digital storytelling become a powerful tool for them for advocacy, raising awareness and challenging power structures by bringing those lived experiences directly into conversation with decision makers. Next slide, please. Here, I wanted to also share a little bit of the example of how I use participatory photography in the context of maternal newborn care, equitable maternal newborn care of Middle Eastern community. So Mom to New Co-Care is a community-led art-based research project focused on equitable maternal newborn care for new migrant women from Middle East living in Canada. We use photo voice focus group in the interviews and consultation to engage migrant women and partner organization to co-produce knowledge and action. At macro level, we examine how immigration policy and our institutional practices create systemic barrier and discrimination for this population. At meso level, we are exploring how social, legal, and health services can collaborate more effectively to address this discrimination and inequities. And at micro level, we are centering lived experiences to better understand what equitable care actually look like from the perspective of this woman. The ultimate goal is to co-create that action plan that brings together diverse sectors and diverse way of knowing to respond to the needs identified through this participatory process. So we asked the participants of this study to go out to their community and take pictures capture the experience of immigration, healthcare system, and settlement system. So this was more about also intersection of these different sectors. They brought many amazing arts and picture, and here are just 3 examples that we can reflect on a little bit to maybe you want to use a chat box or just pause on these pictures. What do you think this participant of this study are conveying with these pictures? And what do you think these pictures are trying to bring forward in about when it comes to the maternal newborn care, settlement services, and healthcare services, immigration system, when all these 3 sectors also intersect together to define the health and well-being outcome of migrant women. We just 30 seconds pause and we can together review some of the examples. Okay. Maybe next slide. It's an uphill battle, the stairs. Yeah, that's a good guess. So I will just reveal some of the hierarchy, many options. Yeah, because we are short on time, I'm gonna dive into the quotes that mothers shared with us. So this mother brought this picture and said, this is an image of a child with autism who is set to start school in few months, but still cannot communicate verbally with the world around him. He must walk a difficult, isolated path. How he will connect with other children his age and how he will learn our questions his mother reviews in her mind every day. This long prison-like corridor reflects the fear and despair of both mother and child towards the support system for children with autism, which have taken no appropriate action for him to the age of 5. So you see how much more than words a picture means here, and how much more emotion and more touch with the lived experience of this mother we can feel from this picture. Next slide, please. One of the participants of study take this picture taken to the next level and decided to draw for us. She draw and focus on the immigration system, discriminatory practice of immigration system in Canada, and said, half of me is in darkness, hopeless because of IRCC, Immigration System Canada, rejection letter. The other half is in light, full of hope for being a mother and my baby in the crib. My arms are open but empty, showing my loneliness and lack of support. And the suitcase that was supposed to bring support is still far away in the distance. She received a rejection letter for her mother to be here for her during the birth. Okay, next slide. Our participant brought so many courage, honesty, and deep sense of commitment to the process, but it wasn't easy. Many of them shared that how emotionally challenging it was to open up to capture these pictures, especially about sensitive topics like postpartum depression, personal and family struggles. There was a fear of being judged or appearing vulnerable or being misunderstood, especially when sharing part of their stories with others outside their culture. For some, revisiting those painful memories stirred up some emotion they didn't expect. Yet, that emotional release also became a source of strength. Many participants described the process as empowering, something that helped them feel seen, heard, and even healed in some ways. Aside from emotional challenges, there were also some technical hurdles. Participants sometimes struggle to find or take pictures that truly capture their feelings, and writing the caption for these images, finding the right word was difficult sometimes for them, especially when English wasn't their first language. They also shared that more time and guidance and training is required. So that reminds us of how important it is to meet people where they are at and build that space of support and learning. Another key thing was that the social aspect of the project, it meant to share stories in a group. Some participants felt unsure opening up to others who haven't had a similar experience, but many also told that how powerful it was to realize they weren't alone, that others were facing similar challenges. They stressed the importance of that respectful and safe space to foster trust. And also, everyone expressed a deep hope that their stories wouldn't just sit in a report, but actually reach people who can make a difference. They wanted decision maker, policy maker, immigrations, and service provider to hear what they have to say. They also suggested expanding the topic to more issues like employment issues, academic credential recognition issues, mental health, loneliness, and access to childcare and systemic discrimination. So when we ask them what keep them going, what keep them strong and heal throughout this process, and we ask them to bring picture that shows that that the strength-based features and potentials in the community, they brought picture, as you can see in this slides, related most of the picture related to the connection to the motherland, to their mother and grandmother themselves, to the faith and their tradition. So it just highlight the importance of that land-based healing, intergenerational oral tradition, and faith-based healing in this population. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Faye. I've always found your work so impactful to listen to. But for the purposes of time, I will share our last discussion questions as a reflection and then maybe open up the floor very quickly for some questions from the group if anyone had any. So the last questions we wanted to pose to you now that we've discussed this in terms of methodological approaches is how can you adjust the way that you're approaching knowledge production practices to be more inclusive and enact epistemic justice? And how can you adjust your methods themselves to produce knowledge that is best for all of the people, like we were speaking to earlier? So for now, I'll leave that as a reflection. The slides are in our shared folder, and I'll open up the floor for any quick questions. I mean, we threw a lot at everybody today, so it can be a dizzying experience. It's certainly been a dizzy experience for me and Katie as we have navigated it this last while. And I've had a lot of learning from Faye and all of her brilliance, and I'm so grateful for her to continue to teach me and share. So Lisa says, definitely eye-opening and very useful information. Thank you. So we're processing. That's okay. Yeah, so for the purposes of time, I will say we have one more session in this four-part series. And today, though it be rather cerebral, I would say the last session is close to my heart because now we're going to talk about meaningful disruption and how all of the things we've learned in our first three parts can really lead to some systemic change in a way that we are transforming institutions themselves. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I very much look forward to seeing you all for our final session in December.
All right, so thank you again to Ashley, Faye, and Katie for today's presentation. And thank you to all who attended as well. This webinar will be recorded as well, and we'll all see you for part 4.